Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Bedtime Creepy. Tonight I'll tell 5 true accounts so eerie they'll prick your skin, ordinary people, strange nights, and moments that never felt right again. Keep the lights low and your ears open. Some of these endings linger long after the last word. The stories. Haunting confessions from night shift workers in abandoned places. The story tells of confessions from night shift workers who spent hours alone in long-abandoned industrial buildings around the region. It is based on a series of interviews reportedly compiled from former employees, archived calls, and dispatch logs preserved by a local preservation group. Lyle Ortega was 32 and worked nights as a facilities supervisor at the old river mill that shut down decades earlier. The mill sat on a bend in the river and had been boarded since 1982, though city crews used parts for storage. Lyle lived in a rented duplex a few miles from the complex, and he liked routine, quiet, and repetitive checks on the concrete floors. He had trained other night hands in safety procedures and inventory control, and he expected the night to go the way it always went that winter evening. The goal for that night was simple and procedural: check the steam valves, log humidity levels, and secure the perimeter before sunrise. Lyle arrived at 10 p.m. with a flashlight, a clipboard, and a handheld radio that linked to municipal dispatch. He signed in on an old ledger that still listed names from prior decades, and he walked past a faded mural painted by former employees. The ledger entry later became evidence because someone had scrawled a second name beside his own, a name investigators could not later trace to a living person. The incident began when a maintenance alarm reportedly triggered in the western wing, an area that had lacked power for years. Lyle radioed dispatch, and the response is preserved in archived calls that show a routine tone and short clarifications. He told dispatch that he would inspect the wing and that he saw movement, which he described as a pale shadow crossing above a broken skylight. The message ended with a breathy pause and the sound of running feet that the recording later replayed 3 times. The complication came from other accounts that did not match Lyle's first description of a shadow or a simple trespasser. A security volunteer gave a witness statement that he observed recent footprints in dust near an old office window. A janitor who worked earlier that week reported finding stacked crates in places where crates were never stored. A delivery log noted a small pallet removed without authorization the week before Lyle's patrol. These discrepancies tightened focus because theft, salvage, or staging could explain odd noises, but not all the details reported. Investigators collected material evidence methodically and with restraint, beginning with the ledger that showed the scrawled name next to Lyle's handwriting. They photographed ledger pages with timestamps from a police camera, and they logged each photograph in sequential digital files that later formed a timeline. They collected dust samples from the windowsill that marked the shadow crossing reported by Lyle, and they measured the humidity where footprints were found. The samples contained small fibers that did not match the municipal storage inventory but matched insulation used in a different site that the preservation group had worked on earlier that month. Witness statements were recorded and compared to archived calls, and every discrepancy was noted as part of the case file. The volunteer who described footprints remembered bright lights on the river at around 1 a.m., a detail absent from the dispatch log. A different witness, a night watchman named Soren Voss, age 45, reported that he had heard a metallic scraping at approximately 1:15 a.m., and he later drew the shape of a crate moved beneath a stairwell. Soren's drawing matched marks on concrete photographed by investigators. Investigators also relied on final footage from a low-resolution camera that had been returned to partial function by a volunteer technician. The footage was grainy and intermittent, but it recorded several short bursts of motion that matched the times recorded in dispatch logs. The first burst captured a figure moving near the skylight where Lyle reported a pale shape crossing. The second burst captured the outline of stacked crates being shifted in a way that suggested the work of 2 people. The footage contained no faces, only silhouettes, and it displayed a slow flicker that the technician later said indicated power surges from a distant transformer. Lyle's own notes became key material, and they were presented as a sequence of entries that traced his route through the building. He noted the humidity at each point and the condition of each valve he inspected. The notes included an odd line that read reportedly find key by office door, which Lyle later claimed to have written in a hurry. He could not later explain why he had left that line, and investigators found traces of oil and boot scuff marks beside the office door that matched footwear impressions on other parts of the site. The investigation moved outward to track where removed material could have gone and who would have motive to organize night removal. Interviewers asked local salvage operators if anyone had shown interest in antique mechanical parts stored in the mill. One operator admitted taking parts from similar sites, and he described a pattern of working at night to avoid attention. His description included a specific tool used to pry crates silently that left distinctive marks on wood. Those pry marks were identical to marks on crates photographed in the mill, and the match connected a practical motive to the scene. Complicating the motive was a confession that arrived weeks later from a former night hand who asked to remain anonymous in public records. In a recorded interview, he said he had organized staged disturbances in the mill during his employment to frighten off other scavengers. He described how a pallet would be shifted to imitate footsteps, and how a tarp would be shaken from above to cast a shadow through the skylight. He admitted to creating some of the disturbances investigators had recorded on camera, and he pointed to a period when material went missing from the western wing. Despite the confession of staging, other evidence did not fit the staging hypothesis and suggested something else had been happening in the building. Recent footprints appeared in areas the confessor said were never part of his staging plans. The preserved dust on the ledger showed two different types of boot treads, one matching the confessor's description and one that did not match any boot in the municipal inventory. The confessor described only a single collaborator, yet the footage suggested at least two people moving crates in coordinated fashion. These mismatches forced investigators to test multiple hypotheses rather than accept confession alone. The investigative team included a preservation archivist who checked city records and older photographs for patterns of activity that could explain recurring disturbances. She found an old photo from 1979 that showed a group of workers stacking crates in the same stairwell now marked with fresh scuff marks. The archivist noted that night work had historically been common at the mill when shifts ran around the clock, and she pointed out that some labor traditions persisted later on through informal night exchanges and favors. Those traditions could explain why the confessor had access at night, and why other people might have known where to find particular parts. Concrete forensic analysis became crucial when the team used portable light sources to reveal latent marks on surfaces, marks invisible under normal lighting conditions. Those marks showed movements consistent with gloved hands, not bare hands, and investigators took glove fibers from splintered wood. The fibers matched a type of industrial glove sold at a local supplier during a narrow window in the last year. The purchaser records showed a small sale to an unlisted account that investigators tracked to an abandoned storefront south of the river. That storefront later yielded packaging materials with barcodes that matched the pallets missing from the mill. One twist came from an unexpected witness, a long-retired night watchman who lived in a nursing home and agreed to be interviewed for closure. He recounted memories of a man who worked the mill nights decades ago, a man who liked to hide small items and mark them with painted XS so he could find them later. The retired watchman described the habit as a game among a small circle of night workers, a way to trade favors without formal paperwork. He said the painted XS would be subtle, on the undersides of crates, or on the back of a ledger page. Investigators then re-examined the ledger under angled light and found a faint painted mark that corresponded to the retired watchman's description. The painted mark changed the angle of the inquiry because it suggested an internal cataloging practice rather than random theft. If certain items had been marked for selective removal over decades, then a pattern emerged that explained why somebody would stage scares to clear the space for a known pickup. That pattern also explained why the confessor had confessed to staging disturbances, because his staging smoothed the path for authorized pickup by others in the network. The network appeared informal and tacit, with people knowing which crates to take and which to leave, and they used scares to keep others from interfering. The final piece came from an analysis of the river light observed by the volunteer witness, a detail once thought peripheral and minor. The light came from a barge that made intermittent deliveries to river docks up and down the bend, a barge that operated irregularly and quietly at night. Shipping manifests obtained from the port showed an unrecorded loading the week before the disturbances. The manifest listed generic equipment loaded by an anonymous handler, and the timing matched the disappearance of a small pallet from the western wing. That link connected on-site staging, an internal marking system, and a shipping route that moved material away from the town undetected. Investigators then constructed a plausible sequence from these elements, a sequence that fit physical evidence and testimony without requiring supernatural interpretation. Someone with access to internal markings organized staged scares that mimicked haunting noises in order to discourage casual scavengers. That person or network then removed selected crates at night, moved them by hand to a loading point near the river, and arranged for pickup by a barge operator who kept his manifest descriptions vague. The staged scares explained the shadow and the running feet on Lyle's archived call, while the markings and prime marks explained which crates vanished over time. Lyle's role remained complicated because his ledger entry had that unexplained second name beside his own. He told interviewers that he had been tired and may have copied a name from a page below, and his story matched ink analysis that showed rushed pen pressure. Investigators compared ink composition and concluded that the second name was older than his entry and had been smudged over time. That suggested the ledger had been folded and exposed to repeated handling, and it added credence to the retired watchman's assertion that workers had historically annotated the ledger for internal use. The confessor admitted to some of his staging and to collaborating with another person, but he insisted he had not known about the barge pickup or the larger network. His testimony appeared credible in part because independent evidence showed chains of custody beyond his confessed actions. The confessor pointed to a single small warehouse across town where he had delivered boxes for a fee, and investigators found records of payments that tied his schedule to the missing pallets. The warehouse owner gave a witness statement that described a middleman who paid cash and asked for haste, which matched recorded times at the mill. The payoff connected small details that earlier seemed mundane and unimportant, details like the way light broke through the skylight when a tarp was shaken, and like the shape of pry marks on wooden slats. Those details fit a broader pattern of concealment rooted in old labor customs, opportunistic salvage, and a willing shipping line. The haunting the night shift workers confessed to was both real in the sense of very real fear, and also orchestrated by people with practical motives that did not require ghosts to explain them. The story concluded that many confessions were fragmentary windows into a network of practice, and that some confessions were sincere while others were strategic. In the end, Lyle left the city and found work in a distant warehouse, a quiet job with daylight hours. The confessor faced minor charges and agreed to testify in exchange for leniency in certain counts. The preservation group cataloged the remaining artifacts and painted warning notices where markings had been discovered so future workers would not misinterpret deliberate staging as supernatural activity. Local historians later published a short account that used archival evidence, witness statements, and dispatch logs to reconstruct the events without sensationalism. The closing thought comes from the retired watchman who said that night work tends to bend a person to superstition and habit. He said sometimes people make the shadows with a tarp, and sometimes people leave small marks to remember where they buried their favors. He paused, then said that mistakes happen and that the night only feels haunted when people try to hide what they have been doing there all along. Static visual shows a narrow concrete stairwell with flaking paint, a single flickering bulb, a dusty ledger open to a page with faint marks, and a shadow stretching toward the river. The stories: terrifying real encounters with shadow beings on remote highways. In 2019, a regional dispatch log recorded several calls reporting a dark figure moving along a desert highway. Those entries were later matched to dashcam footage and to gas station receipts collected during a routine accident investigation. Larkin Reyes was 38 and worked as a long-haul truck driver on intermountain routes for a regional carrier. That morning, Larkin left a small-town diner with a load of processed goods and a plan to reach the next terminal. The route ran through stretches of two-lane road where cell service was patchy and rest stops were sparse. Around noon, Larkin noticed headlights behind his rig that seemed to appear and vanish without consistent speed or pattern. He pulled over at the only turnout to check the load and found a truck engine light blinking erratically on his dashboard. While he checked the engine, a figure was seen near the guardrail by a passing biker who later gave a witness statement. The biker described a silhouette that was taller than a human with elongated limbs and an absence of facial features reportedly. Dispatch logs show a second call from a commercial tow operator reporting the same figure walking on the painted shoulder. At first, investigators considered hoax and misidentification due to light and distance, but they kept all evidence for review. Larkin reviewed his dashcam and found a 30-second clip that he had not noticed during the drive. The clip shows a dark shape moving across the lane in front of the rig, then stopping on the pavement. The shape casts no discernible shadow, and the headlights wash across it without reflecting a conventional silhouette. Larkin sent the file to his dispatcher and to a local sheriff who logged the submission into the official case file. Investigators obtained traffic camera footage from a mile down the road and synchronized timestamps to the dash cam file for comparison. The traffic camera shows nothing at first, then a disturbance on the asphalt that bends light in an unusual pattern. A mechanic at a nearby station reported later that their infrared thermometer registered a sudden drop in surface temperature by several degrees. Witness statements repeated small details such as a wet sheen on the pavement and hair raised on a witness' neck. Local EMT logs include a notation about an elderly motorist who felt nauseous and dizzy shortly after passing the spot. Surveillance images from a convenience store show a pedestrian stepping out of frame and wet footprints that end abruptly at the curb. The footprints have no clear heel marks and measure an atypical stride length for a human adult, according to shoe expert notes. Investigators preserved the prints and compared them to Larkin boots, which did not match the unknown impressions on the asphalt. A towing company technician swore under interview that the figure seemed to glide and made no sound when crossing between vehicles. Forensic photos were taken and logged with chain of custody documents that later appear in archived case notes. The sheriff convened a small task group to eliminate mundane explanations while respecting public concern and media speculation. They interviewed the biker, the tow operator, the gas station attendant, and 2 passing motorists with consistent overlapping descriptions. A reconstruction used a truck of similar height, and an engineer recorded light angles with a handheld lux meter at the scene. The engineer noted anomalous readings when the object occupied a specific position relative to the truck and to the sun. Phone photos from Larkin show a smear on a lens that suggested contact with something on the road. Laboratory checks on the smear found only inert minerals typical of that stretch of highway and nothing biological. At night, investigators played back the dashcam with audio and noted an abnormal low-frequency thrum on the recording waveform. An acoustic specialist examined the file and said the signature resembled mechanical resonance rather than a vocalization, according to interview notes. They found no tire marks that indicated evasive action and no collision damage to the vehicles involved in the event. A county maintenance schedule was pulled and showed a private contractor inspecting a roadside tower near that stretch that morning reportedly. Permits and work orders were requested, and a paper trail produced a blanketed summary that did not list the crew names. When investigators contacted the contractor, they were told a small inspection team had used a mobile lift and thermal imaging that morning. They admitted a junior technician improvised a dark cover to shield equipment from sun glare and added an extendable arm for positioning. Photographs from the contractor archives show a cover that appears to have reflective patches and long stabilizer poles when extended. Engineers reconstructed how when headlights hit angled reflective surfaces, the appearance could read as elongated limbs in low-resolution video. The thermal imaging device vents cooling fluid, and the technician admitted using a spray on lenses which could explain the cooling. Footprints may have been made by rubber footpads on the mobile lift, which leave shallow marked impressions without definitive heel shapes. The low-frequency thrum matched a small diesel generator in acoustic tests and correlated with the contractor log of rented equipment. Still, some witnesses remained adamant that the figure had a humanoid gait and a presence that felt intentional and unnerving. Investigators arranged a controlled night test and used a replica setup to compare the visual and thermal signatures under the same conditions. The replica produced similar elongated silhouettes at specific angles and showed light bending across reflective panel edges in camera playback. A final element emerged when archives revealed a phone call between the contractor and a state inspector about an unscheduled inspection. The inspector recalled the technician sounding rushed and mentioned moving the lift into the highway shoulder as they finished work. The contractor conceded that communication with local dispatch was poor and that signage was not placed as required for short-duration operations. Taken together, the evidence points to an improvised inspection setup that created optical and thermal phenomena reported by motorists and passerby. The surprising element was not supernatural, but the speed at which the footage spread and acquired its own mythology online. A short viral edit amplified contrast and slowed frames, producing a figure that looked taller and smoother than the original files. Larkin watched the viral clip and was disturbed by the edits, but he emphasized the original footage told a different, simple story. The sheriff released a summary that did not sensationalize and recommended procedural changes to avoid future misinterpretation and safety risks. In the end, the case became an example of how modern equipment and human error can create frightening illusions on remote roadways. For Larkin, the memory remains vivid, and he kept a printed dashcam frame as a reminder to always drive with caution. The biker took up reflective gear and the tow operator filed a complaint about inadequate notification for roadside work in that county. Reporters labeled the footage in sensational headlines, while researchers studied how perception and camera limitations combined to mislead viewers. A final review recommended stricter notification protocols for short inspections and better coordination between contractors and highway patrol units. Those measures were meant to prevent unnecessary stops that place motorists and workers at risk on lonely stretches of pavement. Not every detail was settled, and some witnesses still described an uncanny quality that the replicated tests could not fully reproduce. Investigators left open a small margin of unknown in their report, while also urging caution about viral editing and misattribution of footage. Local folklore absorbed the incident quickly, and the phrase shadow being became shorthand for strange road sightings going forward in that region. For professionals, the episode reinforced simple lessons about documentation, chain of custody, and transparent communication between agencies during roadside operations. A year later, a local safety bulletin referenced the case and emphasized standard marking and advance warning for transient inspection crews. Larkin kept driving, and he shared his footage with fellow drivers to illustrate how ordinary tools can create alarming scenes at night. He sometimes sighed when asked about shadow beings, and he always described his account without embellishment and with quiet, steady language. In interviews, he noted how perception can be hijacked by angle and by expectation when drivers are tired on long stretches. The event remained a cautionary tale in regional driver forums and in training sessions for night operations among utility contractors. Years later, researchers cited the footage in a study about digital alteration and the psychology of mass misperception during unexpected roadside encounters. Nobody proved anything supernatural, and the final file rests mostly as a curious example of circumstance, technology, and human response colliding. When told the full account, some locals still whisper about a shadow on lonely nights and treat the spot with extra care. The dash cam frame Larkin kept sits in a drawer, and he looks at it when the highway seems too quiet. He no longer fears shadows, but he respects how quickly ordinary things can become stories that frighten a traveling public. The official report remained cautious and used phrases like reportedly and witness statements to signal uncertainty and to avoid definitive claims. For listeners, the episode asks a quieter question about what people are willing to believe based on shadows and smartphone edits. It also serves as a reminder that safety protocols and clear communication can prevent confusion that turns simple inspections into scary legends. This account remains based on compiled reports, archived footage, and witness statements, with the caveat that some unknowns were never fully resolved. Nevertheless, the title of shadow being stuck, and the phrase now reminds drivers to treat roadside work with attention and respect. Nobody claims the entire mystery vanished, but the investigation turned a terrifying rumor into a lesson about perception and procedure. In that way, the story matches the title and remains rooted in real people making imperfect decisions under dim light. The final note in the file asks for better signage and more oversight along those remote stretches to prevent future scares. People still talk about the clip at truck stops, and the phrase shadow being elicits equal parts skepticism and unease. The narrative stayed grounded because investigators documented their work, because footage was preserved, and because witnesses were interviewed under oath reportedly. The case is ordinary and human, and it stands as a reminder that terrifying moments can come from mundane origins. Records remain available to researchers, and the dashcam clip survives as a preserved exhibit in the county file for future review. Those who study such phenomena often stress the interplay of context, technology, and tired human perception when explaining strange sightings on highways. What remains is a short reel report about a day when reflective panels, spray, and a lift met under low sun. That explanation does not erase the fear people felt that day, nor does it change how images carry power beyond their origin. The file is closed but not completely settled, and the phrase shadow being will likely remain in regional talk. If listeners take one lesson, it should be to preserve footage and to communicate with local authorities before roadside work begins. The story began on a bright highway shoulder and ended up as a cautionary tale about perception and safety policies. It also shows how ordinary objects under particular conditions can be read as something much stranger by viewers and witnesses alike. The county file, the dashcam, and the witness statements remain available and together offer a patient explanation for the encounter. Still, Larkin keeps the frame in a drawer and sometimes shows it to new drivers as a quiet way to teach vigilance. The original files live under chain of custody, and researchers may someday re-examine them with new tools and fresh perspectives. Until then, the tale stands as a careful account of people and machines appearing together on empty highways. Title and rumor will persist, but the documented record offers a sober view of how a terrifying moment was constructed. Neighbors recall the county crews moving equipment at odd hours, and they now insist on seeing permits before agreeing to lane closures. Academic commentators use the clip in lectures to illustrate signal processing artifacts and how human perception completes missing information under stress. Larkin sometimes meets other drivers over coffee, and they trade stories about odd lights that cause big scares at night. He listens without ridicule, and he reminds them to keep records of timestamps and to preserve originals for safety reviews. The county now posts a laminated notice about unplanned inspections, and contractors are required to file a morning intent form with dispatch. Some still prefer the older explanation that shadows can be alive and that the road holds mysteries best left alone after dusk. Investigators accept such beliefs while urging better data collection, and they hold open the possibility that not every anomaly is fully understood. The case sits between belief and documentation, and it remains a useful study for both safety professionals and curious listeners. The stories. Chilling survival tales from campers who heard voices in the woods. This account focuses on a single incident reported by campers who heard voices in a remote forested recreation area. It was documented in ranger reports, dispatch logs, and recorded witness statements collected after the event. Maren Huxley was 34 and worked as a wilderness medic for a county search and rescue team. On a cool morning in late summer of 2019, she drove toward a campground by an unnamed river valley. Her goal that day was simple: check an overdue permit and treat any injuries reported by park staff. When she arrived, staff pointed to a pair of tents set farther into a stand of pines. They looked shaken. 2 campers were already with a supervisor. They said they had been awake all night because of voices calling names. The witnesses described the voices as low and conversational, not a sudden shout or a scream. They said the sounds moved among trees and seemed to reply when one camper whispered back. Reports also referenced a faint light, as if a lantern moved beyond the tree line and vanished from view. Maren began by photographing the campsite and logging GPS coordinates into her phone for later cross-checking with dispatch records. She collected a small audio file from an amused camper who had recorded a portion of the night on a handheld device. The file was brief, low fidelity, and captured what listeners later described as indistinct voices under a tree canopy. She checked park camera feeds from a remote trail camera that had been installed 2 summers earlier near a ridge line. Footage showed intermittent tree motion and a single amber glow that crossed the frame at 3 different times that night. The glow appeared human-held, and the motion of branches matched a person walking just out of camera range. She requested nearby rangers to check access paths, and she cataloged their statements in a paper notebook kept for field notes. One ranger said he heard a distant voice while walking a service road. He estimated the time from his camera log. Dispatch logs referenced a late-night call about dogs barking, but the call contained no mention of human voices at the time. Maren compared timestamps from the audio file and the camera feed. She found a narrow overlap during the earliest glow. The audio at that moment contained a syllable that listeners tentatively identified as a name, though the phonetics were unclear. When the file played slower, the syllable suggested a short phrase. It sounded more like a location than a name. That change reframed the case. Investigators shifted from searching for a lost person to tracing an origin point in the woods. Older campground logs revealed similar complaints in a different year. The reports were filed under unusual noise and light disturbances. Those earlier entries had been dismissed at the time as pranks, but the pattern in locations suggested something persistent rather than isolated. Maren interviewed the older complainants. They remembered voices that imitated parentage or childhood phrases from long ago. She also found a faded note in a cabin log that mentioned a small group leaving after hearing whispered directions at dusk. Witness memory varied, and one account reported a phrase in an old dialect, recorded in their handwritten note as nearly unintelligible. Maren arranged a mapping exercise with a volunteer who used a paper compass and her notes to walk likely origin points. They marked a shallow depression above the ridge that had been noted in satellite imagery as a human-disturbed area years earlier. A subsequent search turned up a dozen small glass shards and oxidized scraps of metal wrapped in cloth and hidden under leaves. The items were catalogued, photographed, and placed into evidence bags. They were later sent to a regional lab for trace analysis. Lab reports returned with simple results. Metal showed common corrosion and glass composition matched older lantern glass used in camp stoves. No modern electronic signal was found, and trace residues suggested organic fibers and soot consistent with a small controlled flame exposure. That pointed away from electronic devices and toward human presence using an older light source to signal or move unseen. Marin contacted an acoustic analyst at a regional university who agreed to run spectral analysis on the best audio samples. The analyst provided a report showing harmonic peaks consistent with human voice formants and a low frequency band from tapping. They also isolated a repeating interval that matched tree trunk spacing in the area and suggested a percussive sender. Marin secured permission to place a directional mic on a short stand and record for a full night near the ridge line. The new recording captured distinct percussive taps at regular intervals and a softer answering pattern that faded with distance. Marin compared the rhythm to the planting chant the camper had identified later and found a near-exact tempo match. She also ran interviews with a graduate student who specialized in regional dialects and recording playback with elder speakers. The student noted consonant clusters that matched an old forager lexicon recorded in an oral history archive several decades earlier. Taken together, the acoustic, material, and oral history evidence created a consistent chain pointing to human ritualized movement and practical seed planting. One senior ranger summarized findings during a staff meeting. He said the woods held practices that made noise and light at dusk. One camper named Leora Kwan, age 27, and a graphic designer followed a voice and nearly fell down a shallow slope. Her flashlight had been dropped and she clutched a lantern shard described later as matching the evidence set recovered near the ridge. Marin credited quick action and calm directions for preventing injury. She later included that account in the final field report. A local historian flagged an archival note about a seasonal foraging group that moved through the valley almost every autumn for decades. The note described older members speaking an archaic dialect and guiding youth with whispered cues to avoid certain paths during rituals. Those details matched the odd phonetics in the audio and suggested a cultural practice more than malicious intent. Marin tracked down a descendant of the group who agreed to speak anonymously, and they arranged a meeting near the river. The descendant described seasonal movement, whispered cues to guide children, and the occasional use of lanterns carried beyond camp lines at dusk. They said voices mimicking names could be training calls, and that older members sometimes used mimicry to calm youngsters during river crossings. This explanation fit both the tape and the artifacts, and it also explained repeated reports across years without clear criminal behavior. However, final footage from a body camera captured something unexpected. A group of adults moving between trees while carrying small wrapped bundles. Marin asked if the bundles were tools or offerings. The descendant said they were seed stores carried for remote planting and restoration. That admission explained why groups moved at dusk and kept to older paths. They avoided midday sun for fragile seedlings. It also suited lantern use, because hand light allowed careful placement in low light without spooking animals or hikers. The final piece came when a camper reviewed footage and noticed a patterned tapping that matched the rhythm of a planting chant. That tapping explained replies in the audio. It was not a voice answering a name but a percussive signal echoing between trunks. The twist made the mystery less sinister and more human. It connected artifacts, archive notes, and the unsettling perceptions of campers. Marin closed her field notebook with a steady hand and filed a report summarizing evidence and cultural context for park supervisors. The campsite was safe and no charges were filed, yet the event stayed in reports as a cautionary tale for future visitors. On quiet nights after the investigation, some campers still heard low taps and lantern cloth rustling, and they felt less afraid. Marin kept the audio and logs sealed in a folder marked communal practices and left the woods with a quieter, wiser patience. The stories, real-life paranormal events reported by movers in empty houses. This account is based on reports and recorded logs from moving crews who worked in empty houses over several years. The narrative leans on witness statements, dispatch notes, archived audio, and dated photographs kept by the moving company. Bennett Hargrove was 36, and he worked as a foreman for a family-owned moving outfit in a Midwestern city. He lived in a nearby suburb and he ran jobs across older neighborhoods with large vacant homes slated for sale. On an overcast morning in 2021, Bennett took a routine call to clear a vacant townhouse on Elm Street. He expected the usual quick loadout and the team would be back before lunch with the truck unloaded at storage. Bennett wanted an inventory note and a few photos to document condition and any pre-existing damage for the client. The crew arrived and the house smelled like dust and stale air with sunlight leaking through drawn blinds on the second floor. An early witness statement noted that the front door had been left unlocked and that a single lamp sat turned on in the foyer. The first oddity came when a small moving blanket slid across a hardwood floor by itself, according to a recorded hallway camera. The camera was not placed to watch ghosts, it had been left to document condition for insurance, so the footage felt unusual. The moving crew felt uneasy and they confided later that the house texture sounded hollow and amplified footsteps in strange ways. A helper named Marisol Vega was 28 and she worked nights occasionally as a mover while studying nursing during the day. Marisol took photos that morning. She said she felt a presence, but she also noted a draft near an old heating register. Bennett reviewed the footage on his phone and he logged a note with a timestamp after seeing the blanket drift across floorboards. The dispatch log showed arrival time, departure time, and the name of the client who had listed the house as vacant for months. As hours passed, more minor events were recorded and then reported by the crew alongside their workplace log entries and phone notes. A box labeled kitchenware opened itself on the kitchen floor according to archived footage, and several crates shifted without anyone touching them. An internal audit later confirmed chain of custody on the footage, and the camera metadata matched the crew timestamps on the log. The crew left and returned later the same day to finish the job after reporting what they saw to the company owner over the phone. The owner filed the initial incident report, and he recommended a second crew return with additional cameras and an EMF meter that evening. The second crew included a quiet mover named Thaddeus Morell who was 42 and he had carried boxes professionally for 20 years. Thaddeus recorded audio during the night run and he later described a low-frequency hum that the group felt more than they heard. Neighborhood residents gave witness statements indicating they heard irregular thumps, and the complaint to a nearby landlord was logged in an email. The company archived every step and they insisted on a methodical approach so they could rule out inventory error or deliberate tampering. Investigators checked lock logs and utility records, and they found no authorized entry during the night besides the moving crew's reported visits. A neighbor volunteered a security camera 3 houses over, and that footage confirmed only a delivery van passing after midnight before sunrise. The crew set up thermal cameras and motion sensors on a follow-up visit, and they kept a detailed paper notebook of each anomaly. Those notebooks were photographed and uploaded to the company drive as part of a formal internal investigation record for potential claims. The motion sensors triggered with no clear source several times, and timestamps matched notes where the crew felt a draft along the staircase. An electrician friend who inspected the heating register measured pressure differences, and he recorded unusual airflow patterns in the old ductwork. Marisol filed a statement that she had seen a silhouette at the top of the stairs while her back was turned to pack boxes. Her photo of the staircase showed a darker vertical smear near the banister that resisted simple reduction through exposure adjustments. The company also reviewed background on the house, and they found previous owners had reported unexplained noises years earlier in neighborhood forums. A local property archive showed the house had been vacant intermittently since 2009 after a probate case and bank ownership change. Bennett and the owner considered a rational chain of causes that might explain the reports before any public mention of the events. They considered drafts, old pipes settling a faulty thermostat, nearby squirrels in the attic, or pranksters who might sneak in to unsettle workers. To narrow possibilities, they interviewed the last tenant by phone, and they examined municipal permits for modifications or work done on the house. The last tenant remembered odd late-night knocking reportedly while the water heater cycled, and she mentioned a neighbor with a reputation for practical jokes. Company equipment testing cleared radios and battery chargers, and it showed cameras operating on their internal clocks with unaltered metadata files. A forensics-minded colleague checked the raw footage files, and he noted occasional microglitches that aligned with periods of heavy cellular traffic on the street. The crew brought a portable audio recorder for a methodical sweep and a playlist of white noise to test if the sounds would persist calmer or louder. They recorded footsteps on the porch while no one was there, and the audio file displayed a low-frequency peak consistent with mechanical resonance. An HVAC technician found an undeciphered vibration in the old boiler system that matched the frequency range captured on the moving crew audio. At that point, several explanations began to converge, and a physical mechanism felt more plausible than a supernatural one for some investigators. Yet there remained an image on footage that no direct mechanical cause could fully explain: a faint handprint on a dusty glass pane. The handprint appeared smeared and partial, and it showed no glove line or clear pattern typical of accidental soil transfer from workers' hands. Witness statements described a cold sensation concentrated near the entry hall, and multiple crew members reported mild headaches after long periods inside. The company documented each symptom carefully, and they recorded temperatures, humidity, and carbon monoxide levels during every visit as standard safety practice. All environmental readings fell within acceptable ranges, and the carbon monoxide detector remained silent during all documented visits to the property. Neighbors also recalled that a former tenant had once worked nights in a factory across town, and she reported odd hours and a friendlier, stoic demeanor. Records suggested the house had changed hands during 2011 through a bank sale, and that the property sat unoccupied for long stretches. The company compared these details to police calls publicly available in municipal logs, and they found no active cases or ongoing investigations tied to the address. Despite that, some crew members insisted the events felt different from ordinary unsettling house noises they had already seen in other empty properties. Thaddeus said the sensation was like being watched from behind a wall, and he wrote in his notes that the hairs on his arm rose. The owner arranged for a local journalist to review sanitized versions of the footage for a feature piece, and the journalist confirmed the overall documentation. The piece used careful language, and it emphasized the procedural investigation steps that accompany the company reports, and it avoided claiming definitive paranormal proof. A surprising twist came when the crew checked archived footage from a realtor who had toured the house 2 months earlier for listing photos. The realtor footage contained a brief frame where a neighbor walked past a window while carrying a large reflective blanket during an early morning garage sale. The reflective motion in that single frame caused a light artifact that on some angles resembled a vertical smear, much like the handprint captured later by the movers. Combined with the HVAC resonance, the reflective light glitch, and an intermittent loose hinge explained many of the observed anomalies in a plausible way. Still, the team could not fully account for the audio footsteps captured, while the porch camera showed an unoccupied entry and no visible passing vehicle. Further review of municipal sound logs showed nearby construction crews working a block away during a separate day, which might explain some audio interference. The electrician later discovered a loose old transformer box on a pole by the alley that produced a low hum under certain weather conditions and times. That transformer hum matched the recorded frequency of the audio peaks, and it explained headaches and pressure sensations reported by multiple crew members. Even after these discoveries, the handprint image remained the most stubborn enigma, and analysts could not replicate the exact smear with gloves or dirty cloth. The investigative team hypothesized a combination of dust adhesion on glass with a light smear from passing wind-driven particles during the day prior. They also considered that an unobserved trespasser might have left a partial print, and the lack of neighborhood reports did not fully rule that possibility out. The company published a summary report with evidence notes, photos, and a chronology of visits as a precaution for liability and transparency to clients. The report made clear it did not assert supernatural causes, and it presented multiple plausible physical explanations supported by archived calls and sensor data. Outside observers debated the conclusion, and the local community discussed the story online with a mixture of skepticism, curiosity, and folklore energy. Some neighbors shared their own small, unverified experiences, and the pattern contributed to a neighborhood story that stuck after the moving company closed the file. Bennett kept a printed copy of the footage frames, and he placed them in a dated binder with the crew logs and witness statements. He sometimes showed the binder to new hires to teach careful documentation, and he described how confirmation bias could make ordinary events feel extraordinary. Marisol kept a note in her phone that she hoped would help reconcile feeling with measurement, and she returned to nursing school the following semester. Thaddeus later said he felt relieved after the engineering reports, but he admitted that the memory of the dark smear on glass lingered with him. The company owner archived all materials, and he made them available to a small independent investigator who requested them for review and a follow-up check. The independent investigator found the documentation unusually thorough for a private company, and she praised the methodical step-by-step approach that led to plausible conclusions. She also expressed that not every oddity needed resolution to be worth recording, and she said these records helped temper rumor with facts over time. A final note came from a neighbor who emailed a scanned black and white photograph taken years earlier showing a moving truck parked at the same house. The photograph bore a faint vertical blemish on a window frame much like later footage lines, and the neighbor called it a curiosity worth noting. That historical image suggested the artifact-like smear might have been present across multiple visits, and it shifted the balance toward recurring physical causation. Yet a thin layer of ambiguity remained which kept the story alive in local talk, and which made the moving crew remember the job with care. The crew learned practical lessons about documentation chain of custody and safety that guided their practice for years, and those lessons outlived the odd reports. At the end, Bennett reflected on the workday, and he wrote in his private log that human perception often fills gaps when facts are scarce. He concluded the event felt real to everyone who experienced it, and that a mix of technical causes and human factors offered the most honest explanation. The accompanying static image for the audio release shows a dim staircase with a moving blanket folded over a banister and a truck parked away from the curb. The visual is meant to represent the mood and to anchor the listener without claiming any definitive supernatural interpretation of the events. In the end, the documented moving reports remain a careful record of surprising moments in empty houses and an example of how ordinary things can seem otherworldly. The incident closed as an inventory claim with no damages beyond a shaken crew and an owner mindful of better pre-job inspection practices. The binder stays in the office, and new crews still flip through the pages sometimes while sharing the story as caution and folklore mixed together. Bennett would sometimes say the job taught him to respect both measurement and witness reports equally and to document everything without assumption. The town's folklore retained the story as a small affair that involved real people, careful logs, and an image that refused a single explanation. The moving crews continued their work, and they carried boxes through many houses afterward with steadier steps and more rigorous photo documentation. The file sits unremarkable on a shelf, yet it has become part of a collection of workplace oddities that push teams to be better investigators. In quiet moments, crew members still swap versions of the morning when a blanket moved by itself, and they smile at how memory reshapes detail. The story closes with a calm reflection that odd incidents deserve careful recording, and that plausible explanations do not always remove the human sense of wonder. Evidence in the binder is real, and the logs are true records, and the most responsible report offered multiple likely causes rather than a single conclusion. That approach left space for professional caution, curiosity, and a modest mystery that fits a neighborhood story more than a sensational headline. People remember that house differently, and the movers remember it as a job that changed how they worked and how carefully they looked. The last line in Bennett's note reads simply and plainly, a reminder to check the obvious before accepting the strange as inevitable. The stories. Bone-chilling true stories from travelers who slept in haunted inns. Several travelers reported unexplained footsteps, misplaced keys, and cold drafts at a century-old inn on a coastal road. The stories passed around forums, and travel blogs became a magnet for curious guests and skeptical journalists alike. Mara Klein was 34 and worked as a travel photographer who booked the inn for a one-night shoot. She arrived mid-afternoon on a weekday with a light bag, a camera, and an exact plan for interior shots. The inn stood back from the road on a narrow lane surrounded by scrub pines and low stone walls. Guest registers at the desk ran back to 1923, and the owner stored framed photographs on a shelf. Her plan was simple: to capture the texture of the wallpaper and the way evening light fell on the stairs. During a late afternoon walkthrough, she found a door that did not match the floor plan on the brochure. The doorway sat at the top of a short riser, its frame painted a faded blue that did not appear elsewhere. It opened into a narrow room with a single bed, a wooden chest, and an old phonograph on a small table. Mara set up a lens and took a dozen photographs in quick succession while she catalogued each frame on her notebook. Back at the inn foyer, she reviewed shots on the camera screen and noticed a pale shape where none belonged. She asked the innkeeper about the room, and he recalled a long-time guest who left abruptly in 1969. The innkeeper said the guest kept mostly to themselves. They paid cash and carried a small leather case everywhere. Mara downloaded the raw files to her laptop and examined them frame by frame with a magnified view. She saved the suspicious frame and annotated it with timestamps, exposure details, and the lens focal reading from her camera log. Mara reached out to an independent photo analyst who confirmed the image had no double exposure artifacts and no obvious stitching errors. She also checked the innkeeper notes and date-stamped receipts preserved in a ledger that sat beside the front desk. An old ledger entry showed a surname matching the leather case inscription, and the handwriting stopped abruptly in 1969. She found a typed receipt for a room paid in cash dated in a month that matched a local missing persons notice. The newspaper clipping in the inn scrapbook mentioned a person last seen near the coastal road on the same week. Mara placed a battery-powered recorder and a motion detector near the bed to run through the night while she reviewed frames. At 3 a.m. the motion sensor logged a brief activation, and the recorder captured faint sounds that matched breaths. The audio contained a soft rustle and a settling mattress creak near the 2-minute mark on the file. A low exhale followed, and it matched the frame timestamp she had annotated in her notebook earlier that day. Mara contacted the local historical society and requested guest ledgers. She also asked for any preserved correspondence from the inn owner. An archivist sent scanned ledger pages that showed a recurring payment pattern and notes written in a neat, elderly hand. One entry read reportedly, "The guest leaves tomorrow," then the writing was crossed out on the next line by the owner. The archivist found a faded envelope to the manager with a brief note and a photograph of the guest at a fair. The photograph had a label dated 1967, and the guest wore a coat similar to the one in Mara's photo. Mara compared the coat fabric weave in both images and found a distinctive seam that matched under magnification. She called the photographer who had taken the archival photo and left a message asking for any backstory he recalled. The photographer returned the call and said reportedly the guest arrived with a leather case and spoke in a low voice. He remembered the guest's unease during storms and how staff tried to respect privacy without asking too many questions. Mara followed the trail to a municipal archive file about a welfare transfer in 1969 and reportedly found a relocation from a state hospital to private care with an agreement for temporary stays. Further correspondence revealed the manager had accepted cash payments and a request to keep the guest's whereabouts private from officials and press. Staff statements from interviews reportedly confirmed the guest maintained separate keys and entered a locked staff corridor used for storage and overflow. Old blueprints in the archive matched the doorway Mara had found and showed a linen closet later converted into a guest room. That explained the odd frame placement, and the owner explained reportedly that he had made the change to shelter a private boarder. The owner admitted the guest often requested privacy and asked staff not to call authorities during episodes out of respect for dignity. He refused to release personal details, citing a promise to the guest and a desire to avoid publicity for all involved. Mara confronted the fact that the pale figure in her photo was a living person, not a spectral echo of the past. The chilling part was how carefully the inn hid that life and how ordinary the protection looked on paper. On an online travel forum, a thread owner uploaded a voice memo from another guest who heard a record playing though no record existed in that room. Mara matched the memo's acoustic signature to the crackle in her recorder, and both files showed a low 30 Hz hum. An audio engineer she consulted said reportedly the hum could come from an old phonograph motor or from a small heater. That matched the presence of a phonograph in the narrow room, and the disc on the table looked older than guest items. The inn changed hands twice since 1923, and each owner added names to the guest register while keeping older ledgers. Those ledgers became the place where staff recorded unusual arrangements without bringing attention from reporters or enforcement agencies. A former housekeeper named Lenora Chase, age 59, told Mara she cleaned the hidden room after storms when the guest returned. Lenora's witness statement reportedly also mentioned small offerings left on the table and a record that played when staff entered alone. 2 previous guests in other years described waking to a record playing and seeing a faint outline by the bed. None of them had reported an apparition like a movie ghost. Most described a human presence that melted when approached. The analyst was a retired lab technician with 20 years' experience and produced a detailed report ruling out common photo manipulations. She included waveform displays and layered exposure maps in the report that Mara saved alongside the audio files and ledger scans. The maps showed a faint highlight near the leather chest, possibly explaining the pale shape as reflected light. She added that reflections could not account for the fabric pattern visible on the pale area, and that required further context. Mara returned for another night and set up a second camera with infrared capability in the hallway outside the doorway. Around 2 in the morning, the infrared picked up a heat signature crossing the frame and moving into the narrow room. Mara reviewed the footage and watched a figure sit at the edge of the bed and reach toward the phonograph slowly. It became enough evidence to show a living presence and not an optical trick, changing how Mara approached the narrative. She avoided sensational labels in her reporting and focused on the chain of care, the ledger alterations, and the archived correspondence. The inn's wallpaper showed faded roses and a repeating motif that seemed to create movement in low evening light. In the narrow room, a wind-up phonograph with a metal horn sat on a table, its label yellowed with age. Mara catalogued the phonograph model in her notes and looked up likely motor hum frequencies to compare with her audio. Municipal police records reportedly showed no active missing persons case linked to the surname in the ledger, and they declined to comment. A town clerk suggested the issue was handled as a private care arrangement in records and cited privacy protections for residents. Mara debated whether to publish the infrared clip and decided instead to include still frames with identifying details redacted for safety. Her editor supported the restraint and emphasized context. The story should explain systems of care, not feed fear. Mara also spoke with a gerontologist who explained how memory gaps and disorientation can lead individuals to seek familiar places for comfort. That medical context reframed the sensations reported by guests as human reactions, not paranormal events, and the tone of her piece changed. Mara's photography remained sensitive, and she left the inn feeling unsettled and simultaneously grateful for the patience of those who cared. Months later, the inn reportedly added a modest note in the guest book asking visitors to respect boarders' privacy. Some readers thanked Mara for protecting identities, while others asked why such arrangements were never publicized as part of the inn history. Mara kept visiting inns after that assignment. Her work turned toward stories that respected people and complicated truth over easy chills. In private notes, she wrote about the line between chill and care and how a single frame can carry multiple truths. She published a careful feature on a travel site that framed the night as a complicated human story, not a ghost tale. Response was mixed. Some readers felt relieved, while others said their hair stood up reading the audio transcript she included. Mara kept the original frame in a private folder, but she kept the memory of the night alive in her own notes. The case reminded many that some hauntings are not spirits but invisible lives preserved behind polite silence and protective care.